All right, great. Thanks everyone for coming. This is the first of three sessions that we'll be having um, every Sunday from today. So next week Sunday, next 2 week Sunday, would have the final two sessions. Today's sessions will be talking about two broad things. First, we would have a discussion on the evolution of debate thinking, as in how modern debates are generally thought about, and some trends and changes that I've noticed in the way in which people generally approach debates, and how some of the best people have come to think about debates. Secondly, we'll talk about how to see tournaments to the end, which is mainly about how you deal with out rounds in terms of strategy and in terms of approach, and how that is going to be very um, helpful, because I know very lots of people who do very well in rounds in competitions, but almost always struggle when they get to the out rounds of competitions. So we'll just have a slight discussion about that and how to see our tournaments to the end. In all, the constructive aspects of the session should last about 1 hour, 1 hour, 15 minutes. So the rest of the 45 minutes is mainly for questions. As many questions as you have, we'll try and answer them. And then the session would be much more interactive as possible. Also, just a side note, as we go along, if you have any questions, you can type them out in the chat space. I would take note of them. Let's avoid typing unrelated comments in there so that I can track much more direct questions that come in place. But if you don't want to ask while the session goes on, don't worry. In the course of the session, when we are done with the much more constructive part, we would have open a floor question session time where you would ask as many questions as you have. So, yeah, the first part of the session, like I said, we'll be talking about the evolution of debate thinking, right? And how debates have evolved in that regard. In this, I've noticed seven key things that I think has changed in the way in which debates are approached, and we'll take them one by one and talk about them gradually, uh, and share ideas and share thoughts about how these things have changed in general. So let's talk about the first thing about how debate is evolving. Maybe this is more from a personal perspective, but I think lots of people share this thought, right? Lots of us joined debate, especially in competitive debating in at the university level. We join debate and we see it as more of an abstract activity, which is to say, we see it as not a relatable activity to a large part of our lives, but more of something that you have to study, some wild studies, some very unique studies to be able to interact with it. So, most of us, when we receive debate motions or debate topics, want to force ourselves to think outside of our ordinary context, to think in an abstract sense, to generate some powerful, unique, very bold ideas. Sometimes we want to argue very theoretical things that we've studied, very philosophical things that we've studied, concepts that maybe do not apply to our real lives, but we've studied them for the purpose of debating, right? For instance, most people tend to think of utilitarianism, which is basically the idea of prioritizing benefits over any other thing, right? Most people tend to think of it as an abstract principle that is applied on some big decisions that are made, as opposed to an everyday life thing where you apply utilitarianism in almost everything that you do, right? For instance, your decision to either walk or pick a bus when you are going to school, your decision to either read or sleep when you're having an exam, your decision to either go out with your friends or stay home and watch a movie, all of them still boil down to some of these things that you end up discussing within debates. Essentially, the point here is that the first thing that I've noticed that has changed in debating is that debate is evolving from being an abstract or theoretical thing to much more of real life situations, which means to be a successful debater in this modern era, you have to stop treating debates as abstracts and start treating them as everyday life activities, right? Which means when you're arguing about things, stop thinking about some unique, complex argument that you can develop. Rather, start asking, how is this going to play out in real life? Right? Start asking, create a scenario in your head, assuming this is the real life. How is it going to play out? So let's take an example. I was listening to a podcast not long ago, and it was mainly discussing the idea that should people paying ransoms to criminals be banned, right? So, for instance, if criminals kidnap or kidnappers, sorry, if a criminal kidnaps your child or your family member and you want to pay them ransom, or even if a cyber criminal hijacks your company and you want to pay ransoms, it should be banned, right? The claim that the person supporting this idea was using was to say money is the reason why these kidnappers keep on coming and kidnapping more people. And so if you stop paying them, they will stop coming. But if you try to transfer that into a real life scenario, I am not sure that's how it plays out, right? Let's just try to construct an imaginary world where somebody's child has been kidnapped and there is a law in place that says they shouldn't pay ransoms. First, it doesn't mean that the kidnappers won't demand for it. It also doesn't mean that the people won't feel the urge to pay it. It probably even makes it worse because now even you paying is a criminal activity that the kidnapper can also use to extort you. Because if I kidnap your daughter, the government said don't pay, you pay. Now I can say if you don't pay me more money, I would go out and tell the government that you paid me against their instructions. So essentially you try and dumb down situations or debates to much more practical scenarios, and this has become the trend. And that's why for some time now very philosophical abstract debates and very philosophical abstract arguments struggle to place well in most debates, not because um, they are bad arguments, but because debates has evolved where everybody within the system is trying to discuss much more relatable, close, everyday life concepts as opposed to some abstract scenario. And I've seen this work for me lots of times, and also for some other debaters that I've seen, where you realize that they are talking about this in a much close proximity where you can literally visualize what they are talking about, right? So, um, there can be another example where there was this debate at the past WDC where it was talking about whether central banks should handle, I think, monetary policy in times of crisis, which is like budgeting and all that, instead of the state handling it. And an analysis that I saw and heard and I felt was very powerful was someone describing exactly how monetary policy is defended, right? He said, imagine the manager of the central bank sitting down and negotiating budgets with the ministries of education, the ministries of health, where they are very, very hardliners, and these bank managers are not experienced in the politicking. They don't have any leverage over these guys to try and nudge them to make concessions. Imagine how that setting would be very, very chaotic and unsuccessful. Imagine these bank managers standing in front of multitudes of crowds or in front of national television trying to justify why they are cutting down budgets with zero political experience, as opposed to politicians who are known to tactically frame issues and make it appealing to people in one way or another. Right? So that debate that analysis was not an abstract conception of why bank managers will probably be bad or good. They bring it down to the real life situations of how budgetary negotiations go and how monetary policy is defended in the eyes of the public, and try to make it very, very relatable and practical. So that's the first thing that is changing in lots of debates these days. Abstract arguments that cannot be related to real life happenings are very difficult to make. And even when you make them successfully, are very difficult to win with, because other people who are making very, very basic but arguments, very, very basic arguments, but ones that happen to be easy to prove or easy to relate with in the real life context, have an edge, and that helps them a lot. So, the advice here is that you treat debate as an everyday activity, the things that happen in your life. So, and that's the thing. Most of us, when we, for instance, when you have a debate about relationships, or a debate about friendships, or a debate about parenthood, most of us try to think in an abstract sense, as opposed to just asking yourself, assuming you were in that position with your parent, or assuming you were in that position with your friend, how would those interactions be like? I think that's the thought process that you have to start going through to arrive at arguments that are powerful in terms of rhetoric, but also very, very practical and relatable, that people can engage with you on. All right, so that's the first thing. Treat debate as an everyday activity, treat debate as your everyday life, and stop or avoid treating it as some unique, complex interaction that you always have to go out of your world to interact with. Dumb it down, feel much more comfortable while doing it. And I'm sure the kind of argument you make will probably be much better, especially with the trend that's going on. So let's talk about the second thing that's changing in debates. The second thing that's changing is something you'd call the technical aspects of debating, right? I think in every generation, there are various technical aspects of debating that become very crucial, or that become the norm that people tend to resort to and speak of almost every single time. These days, there are a few of them, right? The first one, and that this technical aspects of debating that are becoming the norm or the priority in modern day debates, is the way in which debates are framed, or the preambles of debates, which are like, this house believes that, this house prefers, this house supports a world in which, or this house would, which are policy motions, or this house regrets, which are regrets motions, and all that. The very preamble that begins a motion, I've seen lots of debates boil down to what that preamble means and what that preamble requires. And I've seen lots of debate being won on exactly those premises, nothing more, nothing less. So you'd hear a team make a very powerful case, and the only thing the opposing team uses to respond to them is to say, this is a regret motion, for instance. And so the debate is evaluating things that have already happened, and not things that can potentially happen. Insofar as all of ops arguments are talking about things that can potentially happen and not things that have already happened, they are acontextual and irrelevant to the debate. It is not that the arguments are bad or poorly constructed. It is simply that the very way in which the motion is set up makes that argument irrelevant. And to be fair, um, about 5 years ago, debating wouldn't have really prioritized that. In fact, most of those back and forths were seen as things for very upcoming and novices, or very, very young debaters. So you'd hear that, oh, debates that are for very great speakers, they don't end up battling about whether there's a policy motion, or there's a preference motion, or there's a regret motion. They just engage each other in a very robust sense and move on. But when you hear debates about, from let's say novices, you would hear most of the time these novices are talking about whether there's a policy motion, or this is a regret motion, or this is a belief motion. That has flipped such that today these things that we used to see as things for novices in about 5 years ago are now defining the very high ends of debating that we've seen. So you see lots of debates these days where framing is specifically describing the very preamble that begins the debate, whether this is a preference motion and what that requires them to do, whether this is a belief motion and what that requires them to do, whether this is a regret motion and what that requires them to do. And this has become important also because of the recent WDC manual edits that came out. You would realize that the Korea, Belgrade, yeah, these two WDC Arch cores came together and refined the WDC manual and gave some additions. Specifically, in those additions were at some points various instances where they were describing specific burdens that come with various motions. What that did was it made people self-aware, right? And for the past 1 year or so, most debaters have been very, very deliberate about weaponizing those burdens that are imposed on teams depending on the motion that is being given, right? And so you would want to take very much cares. And for instance, specifically for policy motions, right? You have the fiat that the policy exists. So, for instance, if you say this house will ban abortion, you have the fiat to say you will ban abortion. The idea then is that no team can say you cannot ban abortion, right? The motion gives you room to be able to say you will ban abortion or banning abortion would happen. The difficulty then is that you don't have fiat over the consequences of banning abortion. And that's the technicality here. That if you have a policy motion, you have fiat of that policy existing, but you do not have fiat over the consequences of that policy, which means a lot of your debate in that context have to focus on explaining why the consequences of your policy is a good thing and not necessarily whether that policy would exist or not. Sometimes you may want to do a little bit of work in explaining the form or nature in which that policy is going to exist, but I think lots of the work ought to go into, for instance, exactly how that policy affects most people. So that's one thing that I've noticed has become very prominent in most debates. And myself, the past two tournaments that I've won, I have had to heavily rely on this just to avoid responding to people. I remember IIT Bombay, I think the semi final, um, it was a regret motion. No, it was the grand final actually. It was a regret motion, and most of the Gov teams kept on making prospective arguments, which was arguments of things that could happen and not necessarily things that happened in the past. And so every single time I was asking a POI to Gov, I just kept on repeating, this is a regret motion insofar as all your arguments, even if they are logical, are prospective arguments and not retrospective ones, they do not matter. Right. And it made it very, very easy because then I didn't have to respond to their argument itself. I just had to point out that it didn't fit in the requirements of the motion. And so that is becoming a very important tool in modern debating, and you try to exploit it as much as you can. The second thing under that, which is about the technicalities of debating, which I'll talk about very briefly, is on comparatives. And in this case, I would say proper comparatives because I know people use the word comparatives a lot, but most of the time, the way in which they do comparatives is very problematic, right? So let's talk about what I mean by proper comparatives. Yesterday, someone sent me a motion, and let me just try and search for it and read it. I think it was the world's finals motion and was asking me about what the comparative is. So the motion said, this house supports the dominance of the US dollar, right? That's the motion. This house supports the dominance of the US dollar. You know, in constructing comparatives for this motion, someone can see the comparative is supporting the dominance of other currencies, right? Like maybe supporting the dominance of the Chinese yuan, or supporting the dominance of the Russian ruble, or supporting the dominance of the euro or the pound or any other currency that you think is strong, or maybe supporting the dominance of no currency, right? But I think the proper comparative to this motion primarily is opposing the dominance of the US dollar, because here's a twist to it. If the motion says we support the dominance of the US dollar, and your comparative on up is support the dominance of the Chinese yen, the Chinese yuan, right? Is it yen? Yeah, I think the Chinese yen. The truth is, both issues can be good at the same time. Both currencies can be dominant and good at the same time, right? So the Chinese yen being dominant and a good dominant currency does not intrinsically mean that the US dollar, when it is dominant, is a bad dominant currency. Okay. So people end up creating false comparatives, or at least what I call secondary and tertiary comparatives, and avoid engaging in the most fundamental comparative within the debate, which in this case would be explaining exactly why the US dollar is a bad currency in terms of it being dominant, and not necessarily why other forms of currencies, when they are dominant, are good. Because yes, those other currencies can be equally bad, those other currencies can be equally good, right? But that's not the debate. The debate mainly is whether or not we should support the dominance of the US currency. So you can primarily oppose the dominance of the US currency. And I think that's the most important burden here, which means most people end up not debating the comparatives that exist within motions in most of the debates that we see around. And that means that the art that some of the best teams have seen have mastered is really not something supernatural. It's just really identifying what the true comparative is, or what the proper comparative is, and engaging in it even before they go to those secondary and tertiary comparatives. So note, this is not to say secondary and tertiary comparatives are bad, or what you may call competing analysis of some good thing on your side is bad. This is to say that before that thing should happen, you should engage in the primary comparative that exists within the debate, which is a direct disagreement to whatever is being propagated on the other side. And most debaters don't end up doing this. We usually like jumping into the other aspect of it. So if we said, for instance, we support the dominance of the US dollar on Gulf, most debaters would prefer to jump into what other currency can we support aside the US dollar, as opposed to engaging in why the dominance of the US dollar is a bad thing. Right. So those there is a fine line, a very, very fine line between those two things. Let's try another example. And this is also very helpful in responses, right? Let's try another example. Um, I think there was this recent debate in Western Ivy where there was the semis, and then there was a conversation about whether or not, if you are an individual who could see the dates that people die. For instance, if you meet people, you can see the date that they are scheduled to die. Would you like to be born that way, or you'd like to be born as an average individual, right? And here is what happened. CG in that debate said, well, doctors literally live this life every day and they are fine. So, for instance, we see doctors tell people, diagnose people, and know the dates that people will die almost every single day. And doctors are not emotionally stressed. Doctors are not dying, or doctors are not feeling terrible like Op wants to argue, right? Um, I mean, to be very comparative in that instance, I have to deconstruct the idea of comparing doctors to the individual being born with that maybe supernatural quality in that debate. And so I had to say, yes, here's the difference. Doctors are trained for almost 6 years, given several experiences. Um, Guys, please mute yourself. Yeah, so I just had to point out that first of all, doctors are trained to deal with that. This individual who is being born this way is not trained. Secondly, even if doctors uh, are trained, they still suffer from the stress of the work. They still suffer from some amount of depression and fear. It is not an ideal situation for people to be in, and that's why even doctors as a profession, medicine as a profession is advocated to receive a very high compensation because people see things that ordinarily we are not supposed to see and all that. So you would have to take things exactly as they are being said and try to disprove them as opposed to trying to create a different benefit that could come out of what is being said, right? So some people would say, yes, this harm exists on our side, but we also have this benefit. No, I think primarily you should explain why that harm doesn't exist on your side first and foremost before you go ahead to explain whatever benefits exist on your side. So that's the second thing, mainly about technicalities of debating and how it's evolving in terms of motion preambles and also proper comparatives. All right, let's talk about the third thing, which is weighing. Right, weighing has become a very important thing in modern debating, um, and when I say weighing, it is probably one of the most comprehensive things that is coming up because initially weighing just used to be uh, say why your argument is good and say why your argument is better, but now weighing has become a lot more than that, right? So there are three things you do when you are weighing within the contemporary debating space, and you should note them down. The first one is finding a criteria, right? You have to find a criteria on which you are weighing, which means that criteria, you are going to judge your own arguments by that criteria, and you are going to judge your opponent's argument by that criteria. For instance, Western Ivy semi-final, was it the semi-final, the either the semis or the quarters, one of them. The debate was about, I think it was the quarters. It was about whether Western countries, European government of European countries should subsidize fuel, right? Because fuel prices are obviously very expensive in Europe these days. Whether they should subsidize fuel, and we're on up, and so we were supposed to oppose this subsidy and extra spending by the state, and our case was primarily that fuel subsidies would worsen inflation within these European countries, right? Now, so Gov was obviously arguing for cheaper fuel prices and cheaper cost of living. We, on the other hand, were arguing for inflation, or why inflation would happen and why that is bad. And so here is what we had to do. We had to find the criteria. And the criteria we're going to find, we set out about two or three criteria. We said the first one was that uh, we need to look at which of these harms is irreversible, right? Between fuel prices and inflation. Will fuel prices come down or will inflation come down? Should either of them happen on either side? So we looked at which of these ones are reversible. Secondly, we looked at which of these harms will the government be blamed for, right? The government, would they be blamed for inflation or would they be blamed for high fuel prices should any of these things happen? And I think the third one was a discussion on which of these things can be naturally regulated without state intervention. So, can inflation be naturally regulated, or can fuel prices be naturally regulated without state intervention? And so these were the criteria that we set out to evaluate our debates on. Now, these criteria has nothing to do with the cases, which means we can pick several different cases to run, but they should win when we compare to our opponent's cases on these sets of criteria that we've selected. So that's the first job when you are doing weighing. And most of the time, this is the job of either being a whip speaker or being a deputy speaker. And I mostly do whip speeches. And so I tend to go through this process a lot where I try to think up criteria that we can use in terms of comparing our cases and how we win those cases. The second step in weighing is essentially convincing everyone that the criteria you have picked is a very is what do you call it? Is a legitimate criteria, and that should be what the debate is judged on, right? And the reason why this is crucial, and that's why at the beginning I said weighing these days has become a very robust and complex thing to do, because beyond selecting those criteria, for instance, when I said which of these things is reversible, which of these things would the government be blamed for, which of these things would have natural regulators in place, I now need to go a step further and explain why those criteria that I've selected are the right criteria for the debate, or are the most important criteria to be considered within the debate, right? And so, because other teams would also pick different sets of criteria that match or make their argument look good or make their argument look better. And so I would have to explain why my criteria is the most important thing. So, for instance, in that debate, I said the reason why reversibility is crucial is because for actions that affect mass groups of people, your inability to reverse it means when damage is caused, there is a mass group of people damaged for eternity. And that scale and scope of harm should always be avoided when you have the capacity to do so. And so the case here was that inflation is almost always permanent, such that when prices of goods rise, they never come down, even if all the factors indicating the causing the inflation gets better, right? But fuel prices, we've seen over time and time again, go up and down depending on how things go, which means the ability of fuel prices to reverse to lower costs when they go up is much more flexible than the ability of inflated prices or prices affected by inflation to go down when factors affecting inflation are actually taken care of, right? And that impact was to say, which means if inflation stays and it happens, is going to affect mass numbers of people for the rest of their lives, because that inflation is never going to reverse, right? So that's the kind of steps I'm talking about, which makes it another work to do in terms of analyzing exactly why the criteria that you've picked within that conception of debating that specific debate should be the right criteria or should be the criterion that's prioritized. Then the final thing to do is to win the criteria, right? Which means after identifying the criteria, after convincing everyone that the criteria is important, you have to win the criteria. What do I mean here by winning the criteria? Which means you have to be deliberate about comparing your case with other people's cases, or the cases that exist within the round, and explain why your case fits that criterion best, right? For instance, in that case or in that debate that I'm talking about the fuel prices and subsidies, we said if the state subsidize fuel, they will spend more, and that means they would inject more money into the system. And we had various levels of analysis to prove how inflation would happen. And so we explained why inflation is irreversible, but fuel prices are reversible. And so the reversibility criteria, we win on that because we avoid inflation, which is heavily irreversible. The second thing we said was which one would the government be blamed for? And we said currently everybody blames governments, both in the UK and all of Europe, for inflation because people have the perception that governments can affect inflation and can control inflation, or at least people believe that governments have to be able to do something about inflation. And so everybody will blame the government if inflation goes up, and the government would lose political capital, and narratives would not be in their favor. Comparatively, if fuel prices go up, governments simply blame it on Russia Ukraine conflict. They blame it on OPEC cutting down their fuel supplies. They blame it on Russia closing down Nord Stream 1. And even if things are bad, their political narratives are not damaged and their political images are still cool and they are still salvaged or saved in that instance. And we explained why in times of crisis, governments being able to maintain a good political image is good for controlling people and mobilizing people in unity and all of that. And so we want that criteria as well. And I think we won on why natural circumstances can regulate fuel pricing, because fuel corporations just know that at some point consumers cannot afford it. And so they limit their pricing no matter what. But inflation has very little in terms of natural regulators. And so you would have to spend time winning that criteria, which means weighing cannot be the thing you do in 30 seconds when your speech is about to end, which means weighing cannot be the thing you do in 1 minute when your speech is about to end. It has to be an integral aspect of your debate right from the first minute. Um, these days, I've seen people weigh even before they begin their case, right? So that everybody understands exactly the criteria through which their issues should be judged. And so that's the part on weighing that I've spoken of, right? At this point, if you have any questions, you can type them out in the chat space and I'll deal with them as the session goes on. You can also keep them and then ask them when we have time for question and answers. The fourth thing that is happening in the evolution of debate thinking is strategy, right? And I don't know when I say strategy, and here's the thing, the things I'm discussing is really not things that are new. It is more of things that exist, but the way in which we do them are changing, or the way in which we are expected to do them to win debates these days are changing. And these changes are the things I'm trying to point out in this session, right? So let's talk about strategy. Um, there are three things here that you have to take note of. The first one is predicting debates, right? So if you are in opening, these days the strategy is you should be able to play out the debate in prep even before it happens in real time, because your ability to play out the debate in prep gives you the capacity to preempt things that are going to happen in the debate, preempt extensions, and even build your case to be resilient towards those materials, right? And that is a very big advantage, because if you do not do them, most of the arguments that are going to come up will take you by surprise. Okay. Um, so that's the thing. You would have to be very effective at predicting. And there are a couple of ways you can do this, right? The first one is that you should be able to describe teams and ascribe trends or strengths to teams. For instance, if you see a team that is very good in principles, you should be able to know that 80% out of the time they go for a principled case. If you see a team that is very, very good in rhetoric or analysis or pragmatics, you should be able to know that most of the time these teams would go for analytical cases or pragmatic cases. If you know a team that is very good in, let's say, international relations or uses international relations examples a lot or something, you should be able to identify the strength of a team, right? You should know that, well, one speaker is very good, the other not so good. And so most of the perspectives are going to be shaped by that one strong speaker in the team as opposed to both. Okay. So knowing a team is very important, because then you can be able to predict the way in which all teams within the room are going to approach debates, right? So the thing you can do is before a tournament goes on, you can go through the tab, identify various teams, various speakers. The truth is, in most of these days, you can know most of the speakers that are attending tournaments. You'd have probably met them before, or heard them speak before, or seen them in a tournament before. And you can identify, okay, these guys, these are their strengths, these are their weaknesses. That is prior to the tournament. So you have a fair idea of exactly how they are going to approach debates, right? You can also identify the profile or strategy of teams. Okay, I know this team always wants to flip an argument. I know this team always wants to be smart and take the middle lines. I know this team always wants to take the very hard line and explain it. I know this team always wants to explain the simple stuff and win. If you are able to identify the profile of these teams, when you meet them in rooms, you can play out the debates even before they happen. And this helps both in opening and in closing, because in opening, like I said, you can be preemptive and help a lot. But in closing, it also means you can, right from prep, identify where you can insert yourself in a debate and win. Because there are some debates where I do with my partners, and then you would realize, okay, OG would approach it this way, OO would likely approach it this way. I think C would approach it this way. I think if all of them go in this way, this is the best way to outsmart them and insert yourself in a round that beats all of them. And we do this most of the time, and it works. You probably get a first or a second. Of course, it's not a perfect strategy because not all strategy is perfect, but the basic idea here is that you have a much more confident approach to the debate when you have a fair idea of how the debate would play out even before it starts. And that really helps because you are much more able to control the parameters within the debate, as in responses that are likely to come to your case, critiques that are likely to come to your case. And I would give you a very good example of how this helped my team in Western IV final. So the motion was, I think, about some form of universal moral code, right? Oh, what's this? Just give me a second. Okay, cool. Um, the motion was some form of universal moral code. As in, Gav was saying they would prefer a world in which there was this universal moral code, or everybody believed that morality is universal and can just be one, right? Just one moral code is right, and it's supposed to be universal. And we on up were debating a world where um, morality is contextual or subjective to different people, and just like the world we live in, like different cultures, different religions, different groups of people and different societies have different definitions of what morality is. And that's the thing. In my prep as LO, I realized, because it was this house prefers a world where, I realized that the silver bullet on Gav is that if Gav is able to say, given that it is a motion that says this house prefers a world where, and the technicality of the motion is that you are going back in time to the beginning of the world, right? Which means on Gav, right from the beginning of the world, people believed that morality was one and universal, right? If Gaff is able to make use of that rhetoric and they say people believe that morality was one and universal right from the beginning of the world, so there is nothing like conflict or anything that's going to happen. So everybody would be happy and live harmoniously because we all believe in one morality. Then there is no critique that Up can give that would win the debate, because they've already taken a premise or a strategy that says you don't need to go through any process to arrive at an agreement of what the universal moral norm is, because right from the start of the world, everybody agrees on what the universal moral norm is. Predicting this, I constructed a frame that dealt with it effectively. So, what I did was to say, sure, there are things that would change in that world, and there are things that would not change. So, the things that would change in that world is the belief that morality ought to be universal, right? But the thing that will not change is the fact that people are born into different moral contexts or different moral nuances, such that there will still be a tussle about which morality ought to be the universal one. And the way in which I approached that was to say, how is morality shaped, or how is good and evil, or the concept of morality shaped, or religion or beliefs shaped? They are shaped by geography, resources that are available, survival of the fittest, norms that people use to survive, what communities felt would maximize the resources of nature to benefit them the most. And so, given that all of these lottery of birth and parameters and nature and resource scarce and all of those things will still exist, the evolution of the world, even on Gav's side, is still going to end up at a point where people are born into diverse moral conceptions. Now, the debate on Gav is that they have to defend how people would evolve from those diverse moral conceptions to a world where there is a universal moral understanding. And my case was why that process of arriving at that point was likely chaotic, violent, oppressive, and led to wars and all of that. And so predicting debates really, really helped because you could now anticipate most of the critique or even sometimes the strengths of opposing teams and exploit them even before they come up to speak. And that really, really helped because for that case, all of Gav was dependent on escaping that reality. And once you were able to pin them down, it was difficult for them to win. Right. So that's the thought process here in terms of predicting debate. The second one is know your judges. I think this is very obvious, but you have to do them a lot. So before every tournament, go through the list of judges that you have, know them. Also keep a sense of understanding of judges. So if you know a judge that heavily prioritizes practical materials, know them. When you meet them, be very, very practical and be very, very mechanistic. If you think a judge is not so great in philosophy analysis, do not spend so much time on a philosophical case in that instance because you'll probably waste your time uh, in that case, right? So be very, very deliberate about the kind of cases you run, depending on the kind of judges that are in the room. And the final thing that I'm going to talk about under this is knowing your level in a tournament. And this is very important because there are some tournaments you'd be the best team. There are some tournaments you'd be the fifth best team. There are some tournaments you'll not be part of the top best team and the top 10 best teams in the tournament. There are some tournaments you'd easily win. You can break perfect. There are some tournaments you'd struggle to break, which means as a debater, you need to know your level within every tournament. So, like I said, go through the tab and understand exactly where you place in order of strength in terms of the teams that exist within that tournament. Understanding this is very helpful because it helps you set a target and goals for your tournaments, right? That's why personally, there are some tournaments I reach semifinals and I'm so satisfied, and people don't understand because probably at the start of that tournament, in the pecking order in which I saw the tab, I was probably 20th in terms of team strength, but reaching semifinals meant I made it to the top eight, and that's great because that goal was very difficult to achieve, and I've achieved it, and I'm happy about it. Which means you should be deliberate about knowing your level in a tournament and setting goals within that tournament. And this is crucial because when you set goals in that tournament, it guides the way in which you approach the tournament, but it also motivates you to at least try and reach those goals, right? So knowing your level helps you because, for instance, there are some tournaments I know when I'm going to the top room, my mentality is this: I have to win the top room and stay because I know I can. There are some tournaments, the mentality is I would definitely give it my all, but I know the most likely outcome is I would lose the top room and would have to drop down and come and pick points, right? That mentality or that understanding of the way in which you approach tournaments, the way in which you fit into the grand scheme of the tournament really helps you because then you know your strengths, then you know exactly how you have to play your cards. Then you know that when you lose some rounds, you won't be pissed, but you would be motivated because you know or you predicted exactly how the tournament is likely to go. Right. And so that's basically the understanding of it in terms of strategy. You should learn to predict debates. You should understand judges and you should know your level within the tournament to set goals and also to know exactly how you progress within the tournament and get better at it. All right, great. I see a question in the chat. Let me try and address it. So, question says, I have traditionally deputy speakers and whips weigh debates, but isn't it better for all speakers to weigh a debate? Yeah, I think it's better because most of the time weighing arguments as you make them is probably one of the most effective things in debating. Just that most people don't end up doing it, but also the idea that second speakers should do it also make probably judges look out for it more in second speeches, and so it tends to be easier when second speakers do it because judges take note of it. But it doesn't mean that first speakers shouldn't weigh. I know a lot of first speakers who do proper weighing and weigh very, very nicely, and it really affects the kind of debates that they have. Right. Okay. The fifth thing that I've noticed evolve in debate, and maybe this is not mainly an evolution, but a note that I think it's worth talking about, is that nothing is true, even if it is logical, right? So anything can be logical, anything can be proven, right? So that's the thing. You can prove anything, and I think most of the time in debate, we tend to swap logical understandings for truths. We tend to say, oh, I can't rebut this thing because I think it's true. No, to be fair, I think it is probably logical, but I don't think it is the truth because truth means it is absolute. And in debating, nothing is absolute, which means you can challenge anything there is to talk about, right? And I think this is very important because you can disprove everything. And most of the time, the way in which I've learned to do this is to use, especially your real life examples or real life understandings or experiences that disprove some of these things that they are talking about. So I remember there was a debate we had in Zoo IV, which spoke of dogs going to heaven. And there was this characterization from PM that said dogs are treated very well, dogs are very beautiful and cute, and they are fed every day, and their owners treat them well, and they give them medicine, and they bath for them, and they do this and they do that, and all that. I mean, it was logical, and so the conclusion was that dogs who do bad things just do bad things because they are bad, not because they do it out of need, right? That claim was logical, but the truth is that I've also seen where I come from lots of dogs being homeless, being stoned for trying to find food to eat, being treated very badly, rude. In fact, petting dogs is really not a concern here. Even when people own them as pets, they really don't feed them, they don't take care of them, they don't bath them, and all that. And so, in that debate, I just said, yes, yeah, maybe what you are saying is logical, but I think it just defines about 2% of dogs in the world because that's just Western idea of how they treat pets. In the vast majority of the world, in Africa, in Asia, maybe the Middle East, I don't think people pet dogs in the way in which you are talking about. And so, that description, even though is logical, is not true, right? I think what I want to point out here is that usually there is a competition of logics that can go on. And so even if somebody proves something that is logical, you can counter it with another logical claim. Usually the way in which you can then beat that logic is to explain why your logic applies to majority of the world. So for instance, in that case I just said, well, yours just applies to a few people in the West. I think mine applies to majority of the world beyond the West. Right. And you can do this a lot. And usually people just tend to bubble themselves and think the world is the developed context. But I think the world, in the vast majority of its sense, is much more underdeveloped than developed. And so, usually, if you are from a developing background or an underdeveloped background, your experiences are very powerful in describing what majority of the world looks like, as opposed to what the Western sense of the world looks like. And making use of that is very, very crucial in disproving things, right? So don't take anything that is logical as being true. If you understand experiences, if you have thoughts, just challenge them, and you should do it constructively. I think the final thing under this was to say that perspectives formed from your experiences are valid, and this is crucial because most of us grew up in debating invalidating our perspectives or debates or ideas that are formed from our experiences because we ended up feeling our experiences are not valid. And so most of the time when people are saying uh, what is a society what a society ought to look like or what a society looks like. We end up describing the Western sense of society. We end up describing the developed sense of almost everything. Um, it's preferable, or I think it is time you start understanding that your experiences or your knowledge or your perspectives framed by your unique experiences are equally valid, because I know there are debaters who would come up and speak about certain experiences that they have in the West or context, etc. In the vast majority of instances, that's not true for majority of the world. For instance, things like child protection. So if somebody is making a debate and is not specifically situated in the West, and the person says there are child protection services and all that, you can just disprove that by saying, or counter that by saying, yeah, majority of the world don't really have functioning child services agencies, and they are heavily, even if they exist, they are heavily underfunded, deprioritized. I'm not sure how effective they are, right? And that's true because that's the reality within your experience, that's the reality within your context. Validate it and trust it when you are making a case out of it, because it's usually very powerful in terms of weaponizing those rhetorics. The truth is, we do this already, just not enough. So most of the time, we usually like doing it in the negative sense. So, for instance, we say, Africa is corrupt and all that, and we just list it in the negative sense. But also, we do it in the very abstract sense, as opposed to very, very practical sense, and sometimes, very positive sense as well. So, just try thinking about these experiences, and they would be very helpful. All right, let me answer the two questions before I move on to the last two things briefly. So, there's one question which says, on knowing judges, can't we have a universal metric for the judges to use in determining debates, just as speakers have a requirement to win a debate? The problem I have is that judges usually get that leeway of determining who won a debate based on what they think. Yes, that is true. Um, but it's part of the sport. For me, I think it's also essentially what debate is. Debating is your ability to convince people from different and diverse backgrounds and with diverse priorities and diverse opinions and diverse thoughts, to believe in your idea, right? And so, not making it strict is essentially also deeply rooted in the concept of debating. But I guess even if one day that can be done, given that that is not done now, you would still want to find a way to win within the system. And like I said, at the beginning, when I said debating is much more real life than abstract these days, one of the way to connect with many judges is to use real life situations, which means maybe they do not live the exact life situations that we are describing, but definitely there are similar scenarios that they've experienced as individuals, and that becomes a very powerful way to reach through them and make them understand the kind of things that we are talking about. The second question is weighing and comparative analysis the same? Um, Weighing and comparative analysis is not the same. I think I just spoke about comparatives when I was talking about the technical aspects of debating that are evolving. And I also spoke about weighing in itself as one thing that is changing. So I said you have to find the criteria, you have to convince every one of those criteria, and then you have to win the criteria that you found. Those are the three broad steps that you have to go through in terms of weighing, right? You have a question via voice, so just hold on a bit. We'll take questions via voice in a few minutes. So just hold on for a while. Good. So let's go to the sixth thing that I think is evolving in debates. And I think I've probably spoken about this a little bit, which is about proving premises, right? Proving premises. Um, and this is important because most of the time, arguments are resting on a premise for it to be true, right? And so the premise is more of the foundation that needs to be true for that argument to be valid or for that argument to be realistic in its essence. And so, in doing that, you would want to ask yourself, exactly what do I need to be true for this argument to make sense, right? And the most recent example of it that I saw that I was really impressed by was done by Erasmus. He did it in the IIT Bombay final, which is something that I think most people wouldn't dare to do. So, for instance, the motion was talking about. I've forgotten the concept itself. There's a technical name for the concept, but the idea that colonization had really affected Asian states such that it is irreversible, right? So you regret that idea on Gav. And up we're supposed to say we support that idea. And one of the very difficult aspects of the motion was proving that it was actually irreversible because it was a very difficult thing to do. He found a way to explain exactly why it is difficult or it is literally impossible for the structural effects of colonialism to be reversed. And that's the premise I'm talking about. So he had to go back in time, analyze, for instance, how financial systems have been set up, how political systems have been set up, the response that comes when you want to deviate away from standard Western standards of democracy, things like invasions, etc., and the way they've structurally conditioned countries to not be able to opt out of the very effects of colonization, right? And that's essentially what I identify as a premise. It's also similar to the one I talked about the Western Ivy final, where it was mostly a discussion of how moral narratives should be, whether they should be contextual or universal. But to explain the harms of a universal moral narrative, I had to go back and explain why the world would still be created or the world would still exist in a way in which right from the start people have diverse moral narratives. And so, if you want to make them universal, usually the process of getting there is chaotic, conflict, etc. Right? And so, um, that's the thing. The idea here is that as you think about arguments to make, also try thinking about what things need to come together for this argument to be true, what things need to come together for this argument to make sense, right? Sometimes it doesn't jump off right to you, but I think going through that thought process, and one thing that really helps is listening to debates and debaters who've done this over and over again really helps you. From experience, you may try this the first time, it may not work. Try it the second time, it may not work, but subsequently keep trying, and eventually it starts working, right? And that's how all new things start to play out. So, premises are very important for you to prove. You need to be able to know what premises you need to make an argument valid or invalid. And this is also for the flip side, because if you are able to if you're able to do these premises right, if you're able to do these premises right, most of the time you can also rebut opposing arguments in that same light, right? Finally, let's talk about the final thing that I've come to see, which is probability, probability and plausibility, right? It's very important. It's something that I know has tormented me for a while. So talking about it seems a bit nice. So most of the time, what we are taught right from the start in debating is to prove that things are plausible. So that's what we do with a lot of our analysis, and that's what we do with logic, right? Trying to prove that from one step you can lead to another, and you can lead to another, and you can lead to another, and that means that there is plausibility in that, right? The bit of it that we stop doing or we don't end up doing is probability. So the thing I want you to note here is that something can be heavily plausible, okay, but it is still not probable, right? Let me give you an example. And this is an example of a debate where I was in and almost lost that debate because of this. And the debate was we oppose, I think, anti state rhetoric, right? And we're on up. And so one of our arguments was if you don't allow people to express themselves through anti-state rhetorics, usually they want to express themselves through other means, and so sometimes they choose violence, and that means that people would rather become violent, which is bad, instead of our world where they would have just expressed themselves on the street or on social media, right? That is a plausible claim because yes, maybe some people would not bottle their stuff up. They will just go out and become violent and express themselves because they are frustrated. But other people would probably also just bottle themselves up and say, well, if we can't talk about it and we are banned from talking about it, let's just keep quiet and not really do anything major about it. Let's just keep quiet. When they are tired, they would stop, right? These two are probable scenarios. People may bottle it up or people may go and become violent. And so, beyond proving that something can happen, you need to prove why it is much more likely to happen, or the possibility of it happening is very, very high. And that is the probability aspect of debating, right? Which means you have to be very, very specific in explaining why, even though people could bottle it up, here is why for this specific group of people, they're likely to go out and be violent and hurt majority of people, which leads to the bad outcomes. Because if an argument is plausible and it is not probable, usually the response to it is very simple. Teams will just come up and say, yeah, everything that they said is plausible, but I'm not sure why it would happen because I think this other thing would happen instead. And all your analysis that you've done is probably not good. And so that's also one thing that has become very crucial in modern debating and contemporary debating, where you'd have to be heavily, heavily specific in explaining why an outcome that you've made clear that is plausible is probably going to happen. And so you need to invest a lot of work into your probability analysis in that instance, right? So that brings us to the end of the part where we talk about the evolution of modern debate thinking. Um, just give me a second. In the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to talk about seeing out tournaments to the end, and then we'll take questions verbally, and then we'll answer them. Right. So there are five things here that you need to note briefly. The first one is treat every debate independently and don't just transfer speeches from one debate to another, right? So, as in most debates that you've been doing, you've done them over and over again, or you've done similar debates or similar ideas, even sometimes the exact same motion. The risk here is transferring exactly the same argument you used in a previous round into the new round. Just note that there are different debaters, there are different dynamics, there are different judges. Uh, so you, even if you are doing the same role, the dynamics of that room has changed, and so you should be very, very careful in directly transferring that analysis into that debate. That's something you should avoid doing in the vast majority of instances. The second thing is that be highly strategic in out rounds. And so the thing I said about predicting debates, out rounds is the place where you should be very crucial about it and do it because you need to have an upper hand in how the debate is likely going to play out and exactly position yourself to anticipate most of the strategies that are going to come at you so that you can find your way out better. So when it comes to out rounds, strategy is very, very crucial. So you have to learn to predict debate, be very critical of understanding the judges that exist, and then know exactly your level within that room that you are in and how best you can progress out of that room. The third thing is always take a two-team approach, which is in every out round, you don't need to win. You just need to be part of the top two teams that are going through. The only out round that you need to win is the final. And so until it's the final, just make sure there are two teams that are not going through. There are some out rounds. My team has not really had a constructive case or really didn't spend time explaining our constructive case. I just spent time as whip explaining why the other two teams, no matter what, are not going through. And that is sometimes enough, right? It's not always enough, but that's the mentality. The mentality should be that you are taking two teams out of the round, and the other two should be yourself and any other team that's in there, and you can progress with them, right? And then the final thing, the last two things is maybe let me just merge them into one, is that debate every one of the out rounds um, as every normal round that you do, because most of the time we tend to panic in the out rounds and tend to want to take lots of risk, which is we want to be very innovative, very brilliant, think so far beyond the normal stuff that we used to do in the in rounds that make us win or at least get a second. And we want to impress sometimes also because there's crowd and people are listening in and people are watching and all that. Trust me, treat it as the very round one or round three that you were sitting alone in the room with no audience, and you just had yourself and your partner and the other teams, and you had to make it or win a round or get a second, right? So treat it like that. And the reason why this is crucial is because most of the time, almost everyone is panicking in an out round, which means composure is a very powerful tool at that point in time to have, because you are able to make use of the skill sets that you have much more efficiently than people who have maybe equal or even better skill sets but are panicking and do not have composure in that instance. Okay, so yeah, that's just a bit on how to see out tournaments to the end. Take it one out round at a time. Be heavily strategic and take strategy even over the quantity of arguments that you would want to make in those instances. And always make sure that you are composed and you are ready to deliver the very best of versions that you can be within the tournament. So, yeah, um, that brings us to the end of the constructive aspects of the session, where we talk about the evolution of debate thinking and also on how to see out tournaments to the end. Just give me about uh, okay, sure. Just give me about 2 minutes and then we'll start taking questions.